Hello and welcome to Nature Source Care. My name is Dr. Funda Goldman and I am a licensed naturopathic physician and I am also a yoga teacher. So I'm going to be talking today about homeopathy for the wounded healer, specifically the Bach Flower remedy water violet, and also mixing in a bit of my background in the Vedic art. So in any case, let's get started. Note first, the information presented here is for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. For any symptoms that persist or worsen, please consult with a qualified medical professional. It's always best to determine the root cause of any disease and to develop a comprehensive treatment plan, of which homeopathy can be a part. And while homeopathy or Bach Flower remedies can be very effective, they may not be appropriate for everyone or as a single therapy, so please keep that in mind. With all that said, here's a little bit about Bach Flower remedies and homeopathy in general, if you're not aware of it. So Bach Flower remedies are a kind of homeopathy, and homeopathy is a type of energy medicine. It's its own paradigm of medicine, which is quite distinct from conventional modern or Western medicine. It's called by different things. If you're interested in more background or history on Bach Flower remedies and homeopathy, I would check out my first Bach Flower remedy video on the Walnut remedy. The general concept, though, is that disease essentially stems from an inner struggle. So it's an energetic sort of knot within somebody. You might think about it that way. So what I find in my practice is that Bach Flower remedies can be very effective for mental, emotional, and spiritual conditions or situations that people might be facing. So when we're talking about the Bach Flower remedy water violet, the key note you kind of want to think about or note about somebody, or when you see it in somebody, you might think, oh, they might be a water violet type person. So somebody who tends to be withdrawn or reserved. So there are many reasons why somebody can be withdrawn or reserved. I mean, anything from autistic to depressed. But the inner state, and this is how you, again, went to the magic and homeopathy and the Bach Flower remedies, is that you need to be aware of the subtleties of the different remedies to get the right one. So, in any case, for this particular remedy, what you're looking for or trying to assess on a deeper level of somebody is that the reason why they're withdrawn and reserved is because they're basically in this sort of energetic self-preservation. And I'll get into more of what that means and looks like in the next slide. So water violet symptoms, like how might somebody be sort of presenting or show up that might indicate this kind of remedy that might be helpful for them. So a water violet type is somebody who's delicate but upright. So kind of like a water violet plant, because most water plants are fairly sensitive and fairly delicate because they float in water, they're not like oak trees, right? So it's a different kind of thing. And then the part of the plant that gives the plant stability is actually below the surface. So there's something kind of can seem sort of unseen or even mysterious about this type of person, because there's a lot going on underneath the surface that most people will not be aware of or have access to. So this type of person tends to be well-controlled, have a well-controlled personality, and be conscientious. They tend to be self-contained and independent, peaceful and calm, and you might even, the phrase grace under fire might come to mind when you see these type of people. There's not a lot that kind of ruffles their feathers. They're great in crisis situations typically, because they tend to maintain their equilibrium better than most people. The thing though is that they may come across as being haughty or arrogant or unapproachable. There may be some of that, but that's a different issue. I think it just might be a lot of people's perception Because when you find somebody who's a little bit keeps to themselves, you might think that, oh, they don't think I'm good enough for them or something. But it's really just the other person's projections, typically on at least a water violet type. So yeah, there can be some misunderstanding or misjudgment there about why water violets tend to be reserved. Like maybe they're asocial, they don't like me, that sort of thing. The other thing is water violet types tend to kind of have this thing where they're a little bit different from others. And again, you could have somebody who's autistic, and they're kind of sensitive, but there's this sort of awkwardness and stuff like that. There's really nothing awkward about water violet types. They're actually quite elegant and composed, dignified. And they sort of actually are kind of cat-like, sort of mentally and physically even. They can be. They move around silently in a dignified way, and rather uninfluenced by others. It's kind of funny, that just something that came to mind. Like I'm probably a water violet type myself, based on feedback I've gotten from other people. But like one time somebody said, she's like the mist, referring to me. She's like the mist. She just sort of like, mysteriously moves in and mysteriously moves out. That sort of. So, there you go. There's an example of some feedback you might get about somebody. This type of person might be inspirational or a role model, like somebody like a yoga teacher, somebody that people look up to. Or the thing about this person, though, is that, again, they're not doing this to, force other people to follow them. They're just sort of sharing and providing possibly insights or knowledge or whatever. But they're not, expecting, trying to get people to follow them. It's just sort of like them. They're just sort of like a fountain, giving. And if people, take from the water is great. And if not, that's fine too. They're going to keep flowing, with their flow. They're going to keep up with their flow. But the thing is, like, if they find themselves in an environment where they're not really being seen or heard or appreciated, and again, we're not talking like great accolades here, but if there's just some sort of like obvious mismatch or congruence with who they are and what they're about and the people, surroundings around them, then they may just bow out gracefully, without much fanfare. They do have a tendency, these folks, we talked about being withdrawn and reserved, they do have a tendency to isolate when they're unwell. But the thing is, like, even if they're surrounded by people, they may feel isolated because they may not feel that connected with other people. And we'll talk about why that might be, when we get into the Vedic arts part of this talk. And again, people might go to these folks a lot, for advice or even to vent emotionally, or, that sort of thing. So the risk for these folks is that they may feel isolated. They may actually become isolated and barricaded from life if it gets really extreme. And if they are too much in their own bubble, in their own world, that can be destabilizing for any mind. And they might end up becoming, eccentric or unstable. So you want to make sure that, a person who isolates is not doing so because they are becoming unstable, because at least in, general psych training, that's one of the things you start to notice is like, who tends to insert themselves in groups more when they're feeling unwell, and who are people who isolate, and then, how much isolation, and is it actually refreshing them or is it destabilizing them further? So you've got to assess that so that, it's not unsafe for people. But the potential outcome with taking this sort of remedy for these types of folks is that they tend to be more solid and balanced and fortified within, because the issue here, and the reason why I titled this talk The Wounded Healer, is because and you could, and we're not talking like shamans necessarily, but anybody who's really just sort of a giving type, who's in the role of caretaker, who could be a nurse or a doctor or a dentist or a therapist or a daycare, somebody who takes care of kids, like teachers, their sort of natural inclination or natural role is to be there for others on some level. And the thing is that if they're not aware enough, or if they do too much of that, their energy levels can get depleted, and then that's why they start kind of withdrawing. Not because they don't like people or they're judging them, but on some level there's this natural alert that goes on that they need to step back so that they can get replenished. Because often, and I found this to be true as a naturopathic physician, is that even simple things like the patient-doctor relationship is not really an equal relationship. I mean, people come to me and ask for advice and information, which I provide, but it's not a chit-chat session. It's not like we're staying down to tea as equals and discussing our lives, that sort of thing. Sometimes I do discuss my life, but only if it's sort of a point or a case to make or an example to give to somebody, so it makes the information concrete and accessible, that sort of thing. Like there's a reason why I do it. It's not because I'm actually sharing with somebody to vent about my own whatever misgivings with life or something like that. So I'm actually not looking for anything. So even when I'm sharing about myself, it's actually to give something to somebody. It's not to actually, sort of without words, request something from them, like support or something from them. So energetically, it's actually quite different. And even, especially, it was funny putting this talk together. I was actually thinking, like, maybe I should have taken this remedy during the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, because that was actually an extreme form of this water violet state. And I'm guessing a lot of, healthcare providers, especially during the pandemic, may have benefited from this type of remedy, because it was just even more extreme. People were having even more challenges mentally, emotionally, financially, looking for work, trying to figure out what to do with their kids, and at least myself, for a good solid 3 years. And this is still going on, even though a lot of people, are acting like it's all over. In my world, it's not over. But for 3 solid years, I kept showing up to support people in whatever way, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, whatever. And very rarely did anybody actually ask me how I was doing. Just even something simple, forget an hour worth of therapy or something. Just because everybody was kind of spinning and had so much going on for themselves, people forget that healers and teachers and doctors or nurses or whatever, they need support as well. And so, I don't know, at least I find that in my own life. So maybe that's why people, have thought I am a water violet type, and I think I am. So in any case, just more examples to support you. But in any case, taking this sort of remedy would help to rebuild and rebalance somebody who may be feeling depleted from giving too much, or not even giving too much, but not supporting themselves enough. It's sort of like two sides of the seesaw. And they would potentially have more reserve energy, so that they have more to energy to engage with others, and be a little bit more bright and shiny. Because that's typically, at least in American culture, what's sort of required, when you're socializing. Unless you're in a support group and you are venting about your life or something like that. And hopefully these folks, once taking this water violet remedy, would have better boundaries, so they become more aware and make adjustments to how they're spending their energy, and maybe if they are a professional, setting boundaries on the hours that they see people or the number of days or something like that, so that again they're not over giving. And again, people would say, well, they're getting paid, but there's a different kind of cost. I mean, besides the cost of like, paying for the lights and the room and the table or whatever, there's an energetic cost, potentially, with working with people that most people may not be aware of. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to the Vedic Art section. But yeah, even if you're, eager and happy to help others, there can be a point when it is draining for you, and it takes you off balance yourself. So hopefully also when taking this remedy, somebody would get better at taking care of themselves and fill their own cup first, before they, again, deplete themselves. It can be like a slow drip sometimes. You won't necessarily know, until sometimes you're just kind of sitting there like, wow, I'm like really exhausted. It can kind of creep up on you like that, so that they can keep supporting others. And then the other thing is that they may also become more conscientious about the choice of relationships that they have in their life. So not just the people that, might come to them for a yoga class or a medical consult or something like that, but they might have to become even more aware and cautious about who they let into their life generally. I know that there was a big transition when I went to medical school, and I couldn't support personal relationships the way I had before. I was kind of, friends with everybody and, talked to everybody. That's right. And as I worked more and more with patients, that required more of my energy. And again, not just time, but there's an energy component that's hard to explain unless you're kind of in this position, where I just didn't have time and energy to have as many friends, or I didn't really, want to go out as much, like, compared to when I was a, researcher, basic science researcher, and I spent all day in a lab and I was working with test tubes and mice. At the end of that day, almost any day in the lab, I'd be like, yeah, hey, let's go out. But once I went to medical school and was working with people on deep levels, that became too much. And, instead of socializing, nights and weekends, I wanted to go take walks, and I wanted to take a yoga class too. And I realized, or, go take some photos or something like that. Like I found for myself that I tended more towards activities that weren't so social, because I found them depleting. So, because again, the energy was somehow being used up in a way through my patient interactions. So in any case, you or somebody might be in a similar state and benefit from this Bach Flower remedy, water violet. But as I've always said with my videos, is that, the magic happens with Bach Flower remedies when you really figure out the subtleties, or discern the subtleties of somebody's inner workings, and then choose a remedy accordingly. So there are other remedies that I've discussed and have videos on that might be also helpful or similar, might kind of cross your mind if you're thinking maybe water violet. So one of the videos is about remedies for feeling overwhelmed, because in a way water violet is overwhelmed, but the video I did included elm, hornbeam, oak, and olive. So elm is for people who over-identify with their role in life, which could also be somebody like a doctor or a nurse who just kind of can't turn it off, and they kind of give for that reason. But that's kind of a different reason than the water violet. And again, think about that, like, somebody who's delicate and sensitive and that sort of thing. That's more of a water violet type, more than somebody who's like a adrenaline junkie, or like needs to be the hero or something. That's a different kind of, again, subtle but important difference. Somebody who needs hornbeam, for example, is somebody who's overstimulated mentally. So somebody who is like maybe a student and like just studying all the time and like worn out from that. Somebody who needs oak, they feel overwhelmed because they just have this sort of like rigid, dogged pursuit of some goal in their life, and they kind of can't let it go. And then there's somebody like an olive type who's just, totally exhausted from long-term over-functioning. And again, that might be similar to the water violet, but again, that's where it gets back to subtleties, is that the olive person is like, clearly they're over-functioning, like they're working like day in, day out, nights, weekends, 70, 80, whatever, 100 hours a week or something like that. That's different than the water violet. It may not be so obvious, like the water violet might only be working 25 or 30 hours. And that may be all they can really handle, because again, energetically, when they're working with people and people are coming in with different sorts of issues, again, people don't realize that part of what the healer is doing is not just giving them like a pill or an herb or something, or acupressure or aromatherapy session or something like that, but the healer themselves is actually part of the medicine and part of the therapy, especially if somebody has a therapeutic personality, but it's their vibe. I mean, the more whole and healed you are as a healer, caretaker, or healthcare professional, whatever you want to call this person, just by being in the room and in the session with somebody, there's an exchange that takes place that people may not be aware of, and that's what's going on with the water violet person. Other remedies that might be indicated. So there's a remedy for somebody who's hypersensitive. So this is Aspen, and this is somebody who's not just sensitive to people, but they're sensitive to everything. They're sensitive to rocks and trees and this and that, and so maybe somebody's a water violet type, but it could also be that they're an Aspen type, where they're just everything. They're sensitive to everything, lights and whatever. Then there's also the remedy Cerato, which is basically for not really trusting your intuition. So you might be kind of a healer, caretaker type, but if you don't listen to your intuition, you won't set good boundaries, and you won't trust yourself, and you'll just kind of listen too much to other people. So again, I have a video on this. And so you might just, people might need this, that, or whatever. And instead of listening to yourself and saying, I got to turn the phone off at, 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock or something reasonable, you'll just pick up the phone whenever, because you're not listening to yourself, and you're sort of catering to, whoever's around and what they need. And, especially if they're pushy or something, you might just sort of cave to that instead of taking care of yourself. So that's a different kind of issue, though, than, again, the water violet type. And then there's also, this might be kind of in parallel with the water violet type. This may be a different issue in a water violet type's life. I did a video on remedy for your true life path, finding your true life path. And that's about the Bach Flower remedy, wild oat. And so somebody in the wild oat state might find them sort of zigzagging, in their work or career life, just sort of like, oh, what are they up to next? There's always like something new, and there doesn't seem to be a set path. And the reason why there's no set path is because a person who's a true wild oat person is actually meant to do something independent, creative, and innovative. So they're not really meant for a traditional career path. They just don't know it yet. So, but somebody who's a water violet type, they might also be a wild oat type, but again, it's a different aspect of their life. So those are other remedies you might consider if you've got a water violet-y type, potential type in front of you, or yourself. Right? So I was also going to mention, since I am also a yoga teacher, this perspective from the Vedic arts. So the Vedic arts, at least that I engage with, are yoga, Ayurveda, or traditional Indian medicine, and Jyotish, or traditional Indian astrology, which are all energetic in nature, from an energetic paradigm. So the Vedic arts in that world they do acknowledge that there are different, there is one kind of integrative aura, or energetic kind of light that people project. And there are different kind of layers or levels to it, and they call them koshas or sheaths. So there's 5 of these. And these energetic sheaths, and the pictures, the diagram here is actually quite nice. Kind of think about it that way. Because especially this one, like the colors almost looks like a flame, like a little bit of a glow or luminescence. That each of these 5 sheaths or koshas it basically expresses a different level of consciousness. So the thing is, part of the reason why somebody who's a water violet type, especially if they are a yoga teacher, especially if they do meditation, especially if they are fasting, especially if they're trying to eat consciously, especially if they're trying to, consume, movies and books and readings and things mindfully. Like myself, I avoid horror films because I just don't want to see those images. I don't want that, energy in my brain. I don't want to process it. I can't unsee it, and that's just not the energy I want to make part of my own level of consciousness. So in any case, if somebody's meditating, going to yoga and fasting and cleansing, and that's going to change their energy. And the thing is, it's like as they become more aware of themselves, inadvertently, they become more aware of other people, and the energy starts to change. The energy dynamic starts to change, or can change, if the other person is not also doing that type of work. And it doesn't have to be exactly the same, but if there's no effort or energy or motivation or interest or whatever in participating in things that are going to up-level your energy, then at some point you might kind of end up separating or irritating each other, almost like water and oil. There'll just be this kind of energetic thing you can't explain, but like you just don't like vibe anymore. Some people might say it that way. But anyway, the 5 sheaths here, the Annamaya kosha, which is the physical or food sheath, sometimes it's called. There's the Pranamaya kosha, which is the life force or sort of the life energy, the chi, the prana. The Manomaya kosha, which loosely translates as the mind, but it's also the astral or subtle body. Then there's the Vijnana Maya kosha, which is the wisdom body or causal body, which is also the place where karmas are stored. And then there's the Anandamaya kosha, or the bliss body. So again, as you're doing things like meditating and fasting and doing yoga and doing your pranayama and that sort of thing, these energy bodies are going to get cleansed and purified and rebalanced. And the thing is that you will start to feel, just because of that, you'll start to feel different, disconnected from other people. And again, it's not necessarily, I know even though some places they talk about, oh, these people are like haughty, there can be that, but that's a different issue. That's an ego issue. But I think a true water violet type, they might say something like, I just don't click, or I just don't feel like there's resonance there. They might use, terms or words like that, because truly on a deep level, they won't. Like just even, when I was just reading about looking at matching astrology charts, so when you're looking at a couple, for example, if the 2 people have a different, vastly different Annamaya kosha, or physical or food sheaths, then they might have this kind of interaction where they are actually repulsed by each other's food choices or something, about their physical body. There will be a revulsion there over time. So again, if one person, and that's part of why, people put on, like, when they're looking for whatever dates or friends or whatever, like, they might say like, oh, I'm a vegan or I'm a vegetarian, because in some ways on an energetic level, not just like finding food, it is different, because, when you go to especially here in the States, unless you go to an ethnic restaurant, your food choices are limited. You usually only get like salad or French fries or, what's the other one? Salad, French fries, or pasta. Pizza, maybe. That's kind of it, for the most part, and other people feel that difference. Some people care, a lot of people don't. but there's this natural kind of, again, resonance or congruence that happens when you're vegan and they're vegan, or you're a vegetarian and they're a vegetarian, or you're gluten-free and they're gluten-free. Like, it vibes, it goes. Like, there's no, irritation, resistance, or anything like that. So, so these are different, again, energy bodies that can, again, from the Vedic paradigm, be part of what's causing somebody to step back. Because on some level, even if they're not aware of the koshas or these auras or whatever, on some level they feel it with other people. And they don't feel connected. And the way that they get themselves back to balance is actually to step back. Because if somebody, again, if you're working, engaging in activities to clarify and purify your mind and your heart and your spirit, and then somebody, who's not on that path, is eating really stimulating food and all over social media and what else? Spending a lot of time talking about things that, at the end of the day probably don't matter that much. And again, it's all subjective, right? But you're just going to be, it's like they say, like, you're on two different wavelengths, but you can actually feel that with people. So it's not really a judgmental thing. It's just that water violet people may be more sensitive to the differences on an energetic level, and they're just trying to preserve their own energy because they're getting depleted. That's the main point. Okay, so there you go. Another perspective there. So in any case, there you go. Another Bach Flower remedy, water violet, to consider, depending on, what or who you find in front of you, or what kind of stage you might be going through. Like, it might actually, I can imagine if somebody was just starting to go more deeply into yoga or something like that, as they're doing their practice, they might start feeling, the energetic shift, and not, again, connecting with people the way they used to. And initially they might get kind of scared and afraid, like, oh, am I losing all my friends? But part of the thing is, like, they're going to end up with other people who are more energetically like them. And not all of them, but the ones that they're meant to be with. And so sometimes that can cause, like, anxiety for people if they're not aware of this process or this, anyway. So I hope you found that helpful, useful. As always, thank you for your time. Thank you for being interested in healing yourself and others. You might also be interested in my other YouTube channel where I talk about Vedic astrology. That's called Light Vedic Astrology. But otherwise, I hope you're doing well, and until the next one, take care.